Right now, while you are reading these lines, something has happened that almost no one on Earth has ever known about. Nearly 40 years ago, a machine the size of a small car flew past a world that humans had never seen with their own eyes, recorded everything it could in a brief moment, then sped away forever. No probe had ever been there before it. And up until today, no probe has ever returned. And no scientific model had ever predicted exactly what it accidentally recorded in precisely 60 seconds. This is not a new spacecraft. This is not the product of modern engineering. It was built before the internet existed, before home computers existed, before most of the scientists studying its data had even been born. And this is the part that is almost impossible to believe. Almost everything humans have ever known about a giant planet 4 times wider than Earth, a world tilted at the far edge of the solar system, did not come from dozens of missions, did not come from decades of observation, but only from exactly 5 days. 5 days alone in the entire history of civilization, and a 60-second flash that no one had looked at for 34 years. That tiny handful of ancient data, which should have been understood in detail decades ago, is now forcing scientists to rewrite almost everything they thought they knew about an entire planet. And the people reopening that data are not using words like interesting or surprising. They are using words like anomalous, puzzling, and we were wrong. This is the story of Voyager 2. And this is the part the headlines have not told you. It is not just what that machine found in those 60 seconds. But what it recorded may have caused us to hastily cross off a place where life could exist. That is something happening right now in the year 2026, when a new eye has finally turned back to look directly at that world. And that is a chilling truth that has been locked in the future, that the next time humans reach that place, we will have to wait an entire generation. Stay with me, because by the time this story ends, you will never look at that faint, quiet blue dot at the edge of the solar system the same way again. Subscribe right now if you want to hear many more stories like this, because we have only just begun. Let us go back to the beginning. A rocket lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida in the summer of 1977, but this time it carried not one, but 2 almost identical spacecraft, 2 twin siblings, both named Voyager. The mission assigned to them was simple and modest. Fly past Jupiter, fly past Saturn, take a few pictures, collect a few measurements, then drift into space and fall silent. The expected lifespan was 4 years, maybe 5, and NASA planned to celebrate the end of the mission around that time. But what actually happened was one of the most extraordinary things in the history of science, and it began with a seemingly small decision that split the fates of the 2 spacecraft right from the moment they left Earth. Voyager 1, although it carried the number 1, was actually launched 16 days later, but it traveled on a faster trajectory and was given the most valuable assignment at the time, flying really close to Titan, the giant moon of Saturn. But the price of embracing Titan was permanent. To get there, Voyager 1 had to follow a curve that flung it up above the plane of the solar system, flinging it out of the lineup of the planets. It completed its flyby of Jupiter and Saturn in November 1980, and right after that, the path to the 2 final planets closed to it forever. That was something that more famous spacecraft never managed, not because it was weaker, but because it had traded 2 planets for 1 moon. As for Voyager 2, it took the slower, more roundabout, less glamorous path, but that very humble path was kept for a much bolder gamble. It flew past Jupiter and sent back the first close-up images of the surface of a planet that human eyes had ever seen, then flew past Saturn and kept going, accelerating as it moved, using the gravitational pull of each planet like a slingshot to add speed, to add distance. By the time that decade ended, that slow spacecraft had traveled farther from Earth than almost any object humans had ever sent into space, and it was still transmitting signals, still collecting data, still operating on hardware that modern engineers look at and shake their heads in amazement. Then it did something no machine of humankind had ever done before and has not done again since. It kept going beyond Saturn into a region of the solar system that no probe had ever reached, heading straight for a giant world tilted in the cold and darkness. 8.5 years after leaving Earth, Voyager 2 finally approached the 7th planet. And what happened next lasted only 5 days, but those 5 days would shape everything humans thought they knew about that place for nearly 40 years afterward. But to understand just how precious and fragile those 5 days were, you need to know what Voyager 2 had to do just to get there. It flew past Jupiter in 1979, then Saturn in 1981, and at each planet it not only took pictures, but borrowed the giant gravitational pull to shoot itself farther, faster, deeper into the darkness. And this is the part that most people never stop to ponder. To receive a gravitational slingshot like that, the spacecraft had to thread an astonishingly narrow keyhole in space, a corridor only a few dozen kilometers wide, and it had to hit that point exactly on time down to the second, while hurtling at about 10 kilometers per second. At Jupiter, it hit the target only 1.4 seconds late, and just 60 kilometers off after a journey of hundreds of millions of kilometers. Stop and sit with that number for a second. If it had been off rhythm even a little, the slingshot at Jupiter would have failed, and that failure would have broken the next slingshot at Saturn, and the entire delicate chain leading to Uranus would have snapped. The whole grand journey lasted 12 years, and every step depended on the one before it, with nearly impossible precision. And then in January 1986, nearly 4.5 years after leaving Saturn Voyager 2, finally entered the space around the seventh planet, and what it found there was strange from the very first glance. Because Uranus is a planet that is tilted. While every other planet spins like an upright top, this planet rolls along its orbit like a giant bowling ball with its axis tilted exactly 98 degrees almost completely on its side. No one knows for sure why, but the most mentioned hypothesis is that in the early days of the solar system it was struck by a giant object and knocked permanently tilted. And because it is tilted like that, its seasons last an awful length, each pole plunged in continuous darkness for more than 40 Earth years before light returns. Voyager 2 plunged into that tilted world, and it had only one single moment. Not years in orbit like later spacecraft at Jupiter or Saturn, not multiple flybys, only one single time, one window that opened and closed within a few days as the spacecraft sped past at terrifying speed, recording everything it could before the planet's gravity flung it onward. At the closest approach, it flew only about 81,500 kilometers from the clouds at the top of the atmosphere. In those few short days, it discovered 11 new moons, 2 new rings around the planet, and measured a magnetic field so bizarre that it puzzled scientists for decades afterward. But even looking straight at it, the planet still refused to reveal itself. The true color photo that Voyager 2 sent back, taken from about 9,200,000 kilometers away, only showed a faint pale blue sphere, almost perfectly smooth, covered by a layer of methane clouds hiding almost every detail beneath. A silent, hazy, hard-to-read world that refused to tell us its story. And then the spacecraft continued on to Neptune, then sped out of the solar system, never to return. This is the truth you must remember throughout the rest of this story. From that day until now, no other machine of humankind has ever returned to Uranus, not once. Every number in the textbooks, every model of its magnetic field, every guess about its moons, all were built on exactly 5 days, and nothing more. And this is where the story takes a turn no one expected, because it turns out those 5 days contained more than anything anyone had ever seen. To understand why, you need to know one small detail about the spacecraft itself. If you look closely at Voyager 2, you will see a long boom sticking out from the body of the craft, extending far like a skinny arm, and at its end are the weak field magnetometers, the most sensitive magnetic field measuring devices the spacecraft carried. They were placed far from the body on purpose because the spacecraft itself, with electricity running through it, also created its own magnetic field, and the engineers wanted to isolate those instruments from all internal interference so they could faithfully record even the smallest fluctuations of the external magnetic field. That obsessive honesty is why a flash only 60 seconds long, something overlooked for 34 years, still lay intact in the data, waiting for someone to finally look. That person came in the year 2020. At NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, 2 scientists named Gina DeBracchio and Dan Gershman decided to reopen the old magnetic field measurements that Voyager 2 had recorded while flying past Uranus numbers that many people had looked at before and thought they understood completely. But they did something no previous study had done. They zoomed in. The old analyses averaged the data over 8-minute intervals, smoothing everything into smooth, easy curves. DeBracchio and Gershman redrew every single data point 1.92 seconds at a time, at a higher resolution than anyone had ever tried. And when they did that, the smooth curves from before suddenly shattered into a jagged sawtooth series. There in the 40-year-old data was a tiny little squiggle that no one had noticed, and Gershman saw it then blurted out a question that would become the turning point of the entire story. Do you think that could be a plasmoid? A plasmoid. Let me explain what it is, because this is the heart of everything. A plasmoid is a giant bubble of plasma that is gas that has been ionized and electrically charged, wrapped and carried by magnetic field lines breaking off from the long magnetic tail stretching behind a planet and being pushed away, carrying within it a piece of material from the planet itself blown out into space. In other words, it is an image of a planet losing a piece of itself. The little squiggle that Voyager 2 accidentally recorded lasted only 60 seconds in the entire tens of hours of data from the encounter. 60 seconds in an ocean of numbers. But if you build it up in 3-dimensional space, it would appear as a giant cylinder, at least 204,000 kilometers long and up to 400,000 kilometers wide, filled with hydrogen ions. And this was the first time in history a plasmoid had been detected at a giant ice planet like Uranus. Its meaning is truly astonishing. Estimates suggest bubbles like this could account for 15 to 55% of the entire atmosphere that Uranus is losing into space, a rate even larger than at Jupiter or Saturn. For 34 years, this planet had been quietly leaking its own atmosphere into the universe right in front of us, and the evidence had been in our hands the whole time. We simply had never looked close enough to see it. And now the story stops being abstract to touch on something much bigger, because the strange magnetic field that Voyager 2 measured in 1986 was not just an odd phenomenon for physicists to admire. It directly shaped the answer to one of the biggest questions humans have ever dared to ask. Is there anywhere else in the solar system that could harbor life? The way scientists hunt for hidden oceans beneath the ice of moons is through magnetic fields, because when a salty, electrically conducting ocean lies inside the magnetic field of the parent planet, it creates an inducible magnetic signal that can be measured from afar. And the irony is almost suffocating that Voyager 2 itself taught us how to read that signal. On the way, while flying past Jupiter, the same spacecraft photographed the moon Europa from about 225,000 kilometers away, and showed us a cracked icy shell, a smooth and youthful surface almost without impact craters, hiding a deep liquid water ocean beneath. The same machine that showed humanity how to recognize a hidden ocean, yet its own Uranus data, pushed us to the exact opposite conclusion. Because when Voyager 2 looked at Uranus, the magnetic field it measured was strangely empty, an almost plasma-empty magnetosphere, with no sign of the material that the moons should have been spewing if they were still active. And from that emptiness, the scientists of the time drew a very logical conclusion that the large moons of Uranus must be dead icy blocks, inert, permanently frozen, with no oceans, no activity, nothing at all. For nearly 40 years, that was the answer, and we quietly crossed them off the list of places worth hoping for. But this is what is haunting. Right in those very 5 days, Voyager 2 photographed Miranda, the innermost moon, and sent back an image of a landscape so bizarre it is hard to believe. Canyons estimated to be more than 20 kilometers deep, a surface that looked as if it had been torn apart and reassembled, many times chaotic, as if it had just gone through a violent event. A world that looked like anything but dead. The evidence of turmoil was right in the photo, right before our eyes, but the story of the dead moons still prevailed, simply because it matched the empty magnetic field the spacecraft had measured. So what happens if that very foundational conclusion, the one that closed off an entire possibility of life, turns out to have been built on a misunderstanding that no one even knew about? The answer came in the year 2024, and it came from an idea so simple it is hard to believe no one had ever tried it. A team of American and German researchers led by scientist Jamie Jasinski of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, together with the Max Planck Institute in Germany, decided to do something that for nearly 40 years no one had thought of. Instead of focusing only on the data from the exact days, Voyager 2 flew past Uranus. They stepped back and looked at the data from the days before when the spacecraft was still approaching to see what the conditions of the solar wind, the steady stream of charged particles blowing out from the sun, were like in the time leading up to the encounter. And what they found explained every mystery at once. Because right before Voyager 2 arrived, Uranus was enduring one of the most unusually intense solar windstorms. A powerful wave of plasma from the sun had slammed straight into the planet's magnetosphere, compressing it, shrinking it, denting it, and pushing the normal plasma out of the system, and at the same time pumping a stream of high-energy electrons into the radiation belts, making them flare up dramatically. In other words, the empty, extreme, anomalous magnetosphere that Voyager 2 measured, the one an entire generation of scientists had used to define the nature of Uranus, turned out not to be the planet's true face. It was only a distorted moment, a snapshot taken in the exact second the planet was convulsing under a punch from the sun. And here is the number that sends a chill down the spine. The research team estimates that the extremely compressed state Voyager 2 accidentally caught happened only about 4% of the time. 4%. If the spacecraft had arrived just a few days earlier, the solar wind pressure would have been about 20 times lower, and it would have seen a completely different planet, a normal, balanced magnetosphere full of clues we should have been able to read. Stop and sit with that for a long time. In the entire history of human civilization, we had exactly one single chance to look at this planet up close, one window of only 5 days, and no other window for nearly 40 years after that. And that one unrepeatable window just happened to fall right into the 4% of the time when the planet was in its least representative, most anomalous, most misleading state. The odds against us were almost absolute, yet it still happened. Jasinski himself said it straight, that if Voyager 2 had arrived just a few days earlier, it would have recorded a completely different magnetosphere, and that the spacecraft had caught Uranus in a condition that exists only about 4% of the time. For nearly 40 years, we had held in our hands a snapshot taken in the worst possible instant and thought it was the true portrait of an entire world. We wrote those numbers into textbooks, taught them to generations of students, built an entire planet in the collective imagination of humankind based on a timing accident. And now, the haunting time refrain of this story turns one more loop darker than before. It is not just the 60 seconds that were forgotten. It is not just 34 years of data lying dormant. It is those very 5 days, the only 5 days we ever had, that turned out to be just an unusual moment, a warped slice of time that fate had handed us by mistake. And the scariest part is that mistake nearly became permanent because no other spacecraft returned to correct it. If not for someone 38 years later thinking to reopen the old data rolls and look at the very days everyone else had overlooked, we might have carried that misunderstanding for many more decades, maybe forever, never knowing we were wrong. And when you pull that one thread, the whole fabric starts to unravel itself. Because if the extreme face of Uranus was only a temporary state distorted in the exact moment the spacecraft flew past, then almost every conclusion we ever drew from that warped shape needs to be re-examined from the beginning. Let us start with the very paradox that has haunted science for 40 years. Uranus's magnetosphere was both inexplicably fierce with electron radiation belts intense second, only to the brutal ones of Jupiter, and yet plasma empty to a degree no one could explain what was feeding those belts. How could a place be both so violent and so depleted at the same time? For nearly 4 decades that was a riddle without a solution, but now it dissolves on its own, because both the fierceness and the emptiness were simply two sides of the same unusual moment we just talked about. And this is the part that truly changes everything. Because if what we saw was only a compressed version of the planet, then Uranus's true magnetosphere under normal conditions is probably much larger than we ever imagined, and that carries a direct consequence for its moons. Because if the magnetosphere is truly that large, then the two large moons, Titania and Oberon, instead of lying stranded outside as the 1986 data suggested, are far more likely to lie well inside that magnetosphere almost all the time. New analyses show Titania is almost always inside, while Oberon only drifts outside for less than 13% of its life. This is not a small footnote in a specialized paper. This is the resurrection of a question we thought we had closed forever. Because if those moons truly lie inside the magnetosphere, then the inducible magnetic signal from a subsurface ocean, if it exists, could absolutely be detected. The plasma emptiness that once made us hastily declare the moons dead now has a completely different explanation, one that does not require death. Maybe the moons have been quietly spewing material into the space around them all this time, only hidden in the moment the spacecraft flew by. Maybe they are still geologically active. Maybe they were never truly dead. And now let us return to Miranda the tiny world with the torn and reassembled landscape we set aside earlier. In the light of the old story, it was just a puzzling anomaly, a stray piece no one knew where to fit. But in the light of the new truth, it suddenly becomes a clue. That chaotic patchwork surface bearing traces of violent movements is no longer evidence of an ancient accident long cooled, but maybe the remnant of a world that once, and who knows, maybe still is quietly stirring from within. What we once looked straight at and hastily crossed off as dead is now quietly demanding to be looked at again. And while scientists painstakingly dig back into those 40-year-old data rolls, something is happening right now in the very moment you are reading that moves the story into a completely new chapter. Because a new eye, stronger than anything that has ever looked at Uranus from a distance, has finally turned back and begun to gaze intently at this planet. That is the James Webb Space Telescope. On the 19th of January 2025, an international research team pointed Webb at Uranus and observed continuously for nearly 15 hours, nearly a full rotation of the planet's day, without looking away. And they achieved something even Voyager 2, despite flying right up close, had never done. They created a three-dimensional map of the vertical structure of the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere, where auroras form, extending up to about 5,000 kilometers. In other words, a machine standing billions of kilometers away saw what a spacecraft flying right past had missed. The results were published in early 2026, and they both confirmed old mysteries and revealed new ones. Webb found two bright auroral bands lying near the planet's magnetic poles, and between them a strange region where both light and particle density dropped off unusually, a gap likely tied to the very tilted and offset geometry of Uranus's magnetic field, the misalignment that has haunted this story from the start. Even when viewed with the most advanced tool humans have ever built, that tilted planet still reflects its tilt onto everything it touches. But there is one mystery Webb confirmed but still cannot solve. For many decades, scientists have been puzzled by Uranus's upper atmosphere cooling in a way that is hard to explain, and the latest data show that trend is still continuing, with average temperatures even lower than what was measured before. This planet is still growing colder for reasons no one fully understands, as if it is withdrawing even deeper into silence. And then there was a moment from Webb that hits like a pang. In August 2025, researchers announced that the telescope had discovered a new moon of Uranus, a tiny world only about 10 kilometers in diameter, with the temporary name S2025U1 orbiting the planet every 9.5 hours. That is the 29th confirmed moon. But what leaves people speechless is not the number. It is the fact that Voyager 2 itself had flown right past that moon in 1986, at a closer distance than any machine of humankind will have for many decades, and still did not see it. It was too small, too faint, hidden in the glare of the planet. The spacecraft was right there, right beside it, and still let it slip through its fingers. Think about that for a moment. Even in the most precious moment, even at the closest possible range with the best machine we had at the time, there were still entire worlds drifting right in front of us that no one knew about, quietly waiting nearly 40 years before finally being seen. And that forces us to ask how many more things are still right there within reach, just waiting for us to bother looking. And that leads us to a cold truth very few people are truly willing to face. Because look closely, everything new we have just learned, the plasmoid, the solar storm, the possibly living moons, the missed 29th moon, all of it came from looking back at old data or observing from billions of kilometers away through a telescope. None of those discoveries came from actually being there, and there are questions no telescope, no matter how powerful, can answer from afar. To know for sure whether Titania or Oberon has a hidden ocean beneath the ice, to measure the true magnetic field of Uranus under normal conditions instead of in a storm, to untie the remaining knots that a single flyby left behind, we must go back. Not sweep through in 5 days, but a spacecraft orbiting that planet for many years, patiently listening. The scientific community knows this well. In the year 2023, the Planetary Science Decadal Survey, the document setting research priorities for an entire generation, ranked a return mission to Uranus, including an orbiter and an atmospheric probe, as the highest strategic priority of the decade. The decision has been made. The will is there, but this is where it becomes heartbreaking, because even if everything goes perfectly, even if the mission is funded, built, and launched on schedule, the journey to Uranus still takes about 13 years. The most optimistic designs aim for a launch in the early 2030s and arrival around the mid-2040s. And that is only the best-case scenario. Tight budgets, technical hurdles, competition, with countless other missions, all of it could push it back even farther, or keep it from ever leaving the pad. That means the window Voyager 2 cracked open in 1986 will still be the only window we have ever had, and it will remain the only one for at least 2 more decades. A child born today could fully grow up, get a job, start their own family before humans touch that tilted planet again. We are living in the long silence between the first look and the next look, and that silence is exactly the length of a human lifetime. So let us step back and think about what this entire story truly teaches us, because there is a lesson here far bigger than one planet. For nearly 40 years we were confident about Uranus. We wrote its numbers into textbooks, called it the planet with the extreme magnetosphere, declared its moons dead, and quietly moved our attention elsewhere, all of it resting on a foundation so fragile it is hard to believe. And this is the humblest thing science can teach us, that sometimes our ignorance does not look like ignorance at all. It does not come with a warning sign. It looks exactly like the truth, carefully measured, published in journals agreed upon by the entire community, and it can sit like that for decades, wearing the appearance of certainty until someone bothers to go back and look closer. The machine that quietly recorded that truth is still out there. Voyager 2, now 48 years old, has been drifting in the space between the stars since the 5th of November 2018, becoming only the second man-made object in history to do so, and is now floating more than 21 billion kilometers from Earth, with just enough power left to run a few final instruments. And there is one detail in all of this I cannot stop thinking about. Many of the scientists reading and analyzing the spacecraft's data today had not even been born when it was launched in 1977. This machine is being listened to by people born after it had already left Earth, an old witness, older than the people trying to decode its testimony. But even a witness eventually falls silent. Voyager 2's power comes from a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, running on the heat from plutonium decay, supplying about 470 watts on the day it lifted off, and dropping steadily bit by bit with every year that passes. That is the clock quietly counting down to the moment the spacecraft goes dark, an unavoidable silence that is not far away. But this is the bittersweet beauty of the whole story. Even when Voyager 2 is shut down, even when it is nothing more than a silent metal block, drifting forever in endless darkness, what it recorded in those 5 days of 1986 will keep teaching us. Because that data has still not been fully mined. Somewhere in those old rolls of numbers, there may very well be other 60-second moments, other flashes no one has seen yet, quietly waiting. The spacecraft gave us its gift long ago. The only question left is whether we have enough patience and enough humility to keep opening it. This is what I want you to carry with you. Right now, the only scientific instrument humankind has ever placed in the space between the stars is nearly 50 years old. It was built with technology that came before home computers ran on less electricity than a small light bulb, and is quietly bringing home a question we may never be in time to answer. We have built things bigger, stronger, far more expensive than it. And none of them were in the right place at the right time to witness a needle jump up and never come back down. There are questions about the universe that can only be answered from inside the universe, not from telescopes on the ground, not from satellites around Earth, but only from a machine bold enough to keep going long enough to truly reach that place. We have exactly one machine like that. It is growing old, it is running out, and it is drifting 1 hour farther into the darkness every hour. And perhaps, just perhaps right now, it is swimming in the last breath of a star that died before life existed on this planet, something we will never know for sure. A machine fading away. A question that may never be closed. Because the real question, after all, may not be where that cloud came from, but whether any of us are still truly listening when the final whisper rises. If this kind of story is what you come for, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Right now, leave a comment about what surprised you the most, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.